welcome to ALCA's budget briefing brunch. We are joining live today from Parliament House here in Canberra on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any other Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us on this webinar today. I'm here with Michael Cornish, ALCA's policy lead, who will be presenting to you shortly on the detail of this fourth federal budget and what it means, particularly for nature. And in the context of an acknowledgement to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we note that federal budgets can play an important role to create opportunities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to own, to access, to manage and to restore nature, and in doing so recognising their leadership as Australia's First Peoples. And they understand more than most of us that nature is not just the scenery around us. It's the intricate web that supports all life on Earth. Our connection with nature goes beyond a simple and sometimes unrealised appreciation. It sustains the water we drink, the food we eat and the air we breathe, and underpins our well-being, our cultural identities, communities and our way of life. Yet this invaluable resource faces unprecedented threats, with ecosystems collapsing and biodiversity rapidly declining. So it's our responsibility to arrest this decline, to protect and nurture these vital systems, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. Australians care deeply about nature and are united in a desire for a healthy and resilient future. And this vision is achievable and within our grasp if we demonstrate leadership and act now. The Australian Land Conservation Alliance represents organisations that work to protect, manage and restore nature across privately managed land, working increasingly across industries, sectors, and providing solutions to Australia's biggest challenges. And I'm Jodie Gunn, the CEO of the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, and we look forward to hearing from our esteemed policy lead, Michael Cornish, in just a moment, who will help us delve into the detail and unpack the government's fourth budget. Again, just a reminder, this is being recorded. Please do, as we talk through, put your questions in the chat there. For those that have been keeping track of our communications, earlier this week, we welcomed the Minister's $250 million Saving Australia's Bushland package. It seeks to advance Australia's goal of protecting 30% of land by 2030, part of a global commitment made in 2022 by 190 nations. This is a critical start towards reaching our 30% protection target. We have the pathways, the science and knowledge to get there. We now need the investment and a targeted strategy to ensure we not only achieve scale, but ensure the most important areas are protected. And Michael will provide more context to the announcement that was made by the federal government shortly. Protecting, stewarding and restoring our natural environment must be realised as an economic imperative. Healthy ecosystems contribute billions to the global economy through ecosystem services and reduce economic risks. By redirecting capital towards sustainable practices and conservation efforts, we can create a resilient economy that thrives in harmony with the environment. But as you'll soon hear from ALCA's policy lead, Michael Cornish, this budget does not reflect the nature of contributions our environment makes, nor reverse the trend of perpetual chronic underfunding by successive governments. And given the budget landed on the eve of an election, it missed the opportunity to move us closer to a vision that is future-focused and transformational, that is ready to address the challenges of our time. The budget speech, for those of you that listened to the Treasurer the other night, was not a rallying vision for a fair, equitable and resilient future. It did not identify that, according to the World Economic Forum, environmental risks are ever present in our short and medium-term horizon, and that with sound investment and a whole of government approach, we have an opportunity to invest in and address these challenges with leadership and innovation. In fact, it was largely silent on some key issues that are likely to underpin our country's future way of life and prosperity. The Treasurer's speech was silent on the wellbeing framework developed by Treasury that has targets reflecting climate resilience, nature protection, and a circular economy. It was silent on how understanding and valuing our natural capital can build a stronger and safer food system, and how investment in innovations in nature-based solutions could support rural and regional communities, urban towns and cities through ever-deepening climate impacts. And it was silent on how Australia's cultural identity is fundamentally connected to nature, from sports team names like the Wallabies to state emblems like the Golden Wattle, global icons like our koala to tourism drawcards like the Great Barrier Reef. These are the kinds of things that we need to connect us more closely to the lands and waters we rely on and that we live upon, that remind us of our responsibility to care not just for tomorrow, but for the prosperity of future generations, and to be stewards of this incredible and unique country that we're so lucky to call home. And so with that context set, we will now go to the detail of the budget with Michael, who's here with me. Again, before I hand over to Michael, please put any questions in the chat as they come through, and I'll facilitate a Q&A with Michael after his formal presentation. So Michael, we're dying to hear more about the budget. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Jodie. I'm just going to share my screen. And I'm presuming that there are no problems there. Very good. So welcome to the Nature Budget Branch again. If I look occasionally windswept, it's because I'm actually at Parliament House, sitting out on the Queen's Terrace, for those of you who know it, and in the belly of the beast, as it were, and very much looking forward to going through the detail of the budget as it relates to nature. All right, so just a quick overview of what we'll be covering. Quick introduction to ALCA for those of you who are not completely familiar with us. Talk through the pre-budget submission process, a bit of a macro snapshot, where we've come from and where we're going to, and some conclusions. So very, very briefly, ALCA is the peak body for private land conservation. Here's the 19 of our wonderful members. You know, our member organisations are managing, stewarding, protecting, and restoring biodiversity for the public, you know, in the public good. I won't dwell on that because we've got a fair bit of detail to go into. I always like to talk, before I delve into the actual detail of the budget itself, to have a look at the pre-budget submissions, because it's an interesting way of being able to gauge what's, I guess, happening at a macro level around the influences into the budget process. So look, these happen every year. You put in a submission, they close at the end of January. And if you're keen, you can go have a look at ALCA submission. I've got the link there, but I think the link will come up on the chat shortly. And you can have a look at all the different submissions that are there. Now, there's a lot of submissions and they're increasing quite dramatically. So, you know, even just in the last, last 4 years since last, 4 budgets, which Labor took office obviously about 3 years ago, we're seeing a dramatic increase in total number of submissions. But nature submissions pretty subdued in that. So, I mean, you'll hear later that that nature receives less than 0.01% of the federal budget, and in that sense, I guess, relative to our submissions, we're actually punching at our weight. So I don't know if there's necessarily a real strong correlation between the number of submissions that are done versus how much funding is actually achieved, but nonetheless, it is something interesting to to reflect on. So I guess that's a pitch for those of you from organisations, from nature organisations. You know, the more submissions into the budget process, the better. The more that the federal government hears from us collectively, the better. A brief snapshot of the macroeconomic indicators. So GDP, these are the forecasts for the forthcoming financial year. They project that GDP growth will be up somewhat from a very subdued 1.5% in the last financial year. Mind you, they do project every year, tend to overproject the GDP growth. So I would be unsurprised if that number ends up being lower when we come to the next budget and look back at the actuals. Unemployment staying steady. Inflation is expected actually to go slightly up, in part, I think, due to some of the second round effects from the Trump tariffs. We're not being directly affected by the tariffs in a dramatic way, in terms of inflationary effects, but it's the second round effects. It's the impacts on, for example, China, and then their trade volumes that then occur with Australia that are likely to cause some inflation, through imported inflation. And this year we have quite a substantial fiscal deficit off the back of 2 reasonably slim surpluses. So we also know that there's a structural deficit moving forward, and there's going to have to be some serious structural reform. What does that mean in practice? That means some serious look at tax reform. or of course having to dramatically cut back on revenue cut back on expenditure moving into the future. Something else that's worth noting is that the wage price index is now finally starting to outstrip the consumer price index, and is forecast to continue to do so. What that means in practice is that wages are finally going to be moving faster, or at least forecast to move faster than inflation. So the GDP per capita recession that people have been talking about, that is finally turning around. All right, on to nature. So I want to introduce this slide to you. Those who've been to previous sessions from me on the budget might be familiar with this slide. This is taken straight from the State of Environment Report 2021. I use this as essentially a framework for analysis, because when we look at, slicing and dicing the budget and working out, what things have been spent on nature and what things are sort of nature adjacent, this is the State of Environment Report attempt at trying to just look at the biodiversity spend, the nature spend, because there are plenty of other things which have obviously nature impacts, or do have benefits for nature, such as funding through the agricultural portfolio, such as funding for disaster resilience and preparedness, such as, for example, money spent on water, can do so as well. But they're of course adjacent in a sense to core funding on biodiversity. So in my analysis, I always adopt the State of Environment Reports approach and then project that forward, and so we can have a like-for-like comparison and just focus on the very squarely biodiversity spend. So anyway, you can see what's happened in the past. I won't go through this in great detail, because let's now have a look at where we're going to. So as of the incoming Labor government, we can see that we've been hovering around the 300 to 350 million amount, and then this year we actually do have a reasonable spike up to $480 million. You can see the composition of this and where the bumps are. And before we sort of go, oh, well, this is really good, right? Like we're seeing a bit of an uplift. This has very much been the money has been very much deliberately loaded so that there would be a bigger, I guess, amount delivered in the in an election year rather than in pre-election years. What's also changed in my analysis is that I've tweaked to the fact that the Indigenous Protected Area funding, which used to go through Department of Premier and Cabinet, is now actually delivered through something called NHT. That's the Natural Heritage Trust. Now, the Natural Heritage Trust is a bit of it's a big bucket of funding. It's a special account, and it's very, very opaque because it's a special account. We don't get to see the breakdown of the funding that gets drawn down from the special account. Now, the background here is that this was a deal that was funded way back in Howard's time, through the sale of Telstra, and the money goes to a combination of agricultural, landscape and environmental programs and projects. And so, because we don't have the exact breakdown of how that Natural Heritage Trust money is spent, it can be very hard to track what exactly is being delivered through that special account. So that's the sort of lighter blue at the very bottom, and it obviously accounts for quite a large proportion of the total funding. NESP, for those of you who don't know the acronym, that's the National Environmental Science Program. That's remains constant across all these numbers at $25 million a year. The Saving Native Species Fund, this is really the money that took over from the Coalition's Environment Restoration Fund. And in fact, you can see I've labelled them now as Coalition legacy programs here, that you see the dark blue as the legacy programs. They ease out, and as the money for those programs is drawn down and spent out. And then we see the Saving Native Species program take over, essentially a rebadged approach to sort of the major environmental grants that go out to the broader sector. So I've also put in the Morgan Skate money in there as well, because clearly that's related to, saving threatened species. And so the uplift that we can see in this budget year is, yes, a little bit due to the Natural Heritage Trust being, the money being shifted to the budget, to the election year. a big uplift in Reef Trust spending, which was always projected. They'd always intended to, again, deliver a higher amount in the election year. But then there's also a slight bump due to additional spending for the Morgan Skate, which of course is a very contentious issue, which we can always talk about in Q&A if people wish to, although obviously it's not too directly related to the budget other than the small amount of additional spending there. Now, of course, the really big addition here is the is the additional Australian bushland project, and that we see that there is the $50 million being budgeted for that moving forward. And I've realized I might have made a minor error, which I'll fix in the slides that I send out. But of course, the 50 million actually is meant to commence next budget year. So that's actually meant to be in the budgeted column. So I'm very sorry about that. And now I think then in the very, very out years, we have some funding for land care rangers. This is an election commitment that was made, but was deferred and deferred and deferred. So it's still technically on the books, but it doesn't appear until, the financial year 28-29. So, all right, what then does this not include? Because I mentioned that this is sort of the state environment framework of analysis. It doesn't include EPBC reform funding, which was quite considerable, over $200 million. However, it's really quite unclear from the budget. I've been looking quite some time to try to uncover where this funding is or has gone. We have been, of course, reassured by the government that this money is not off the table and it will continue. But I must confess I'm struggling to find it in the budget papers. Other additional funding that's squarely environmental that could be included, but in this analysis could be the H5N1 bird flu preparedness, and this is just the money for the environment. So $22.4 million in this coming financial year. $6.4 million was already spent last financial year. There's also a small amount for additional amount of money for biosecurity, so $11 million. Most of that, of course, is agricultural biosecurity, but nonetheless, there will be some environmental benefits, of course, for that spend as well. Another potentially very big amount comes through the Murray-Darling Basin Plan's voluntary water purchases. So, the Labor government has recommenced voluntary water buybacks to try and, to secure environmental water. But of course, these are NFP. It means not for publishing. That's because these are commercial arrangements, and obviously the government doesn't want to, flag how much money they're going to spend on these things, so that people know how much to bid. So we don't know how much money that is, but it's been budgeted for the next 3 years. All right, so let's now spend a little bit of time just talking about the most significant new measure, and that's the Australian Bushland Program. Interesting name, $15 million a year for 5 years. And ostensibly, this is to deliver on the 30 by 30 protection targets that the federal government had, committed, the Labor government had committed prior to the last election, and then reconfirmed, once they were in government. However, in practice, it's many faceted. There are lots of elements to what's being delivered. Now, the ones that I have on this page, and we'll get to some more in a moment, the ones on this page are much more squarely oriented around delivering on that 30 by 30 protection target. So, sorry, for those of you who don't know what 30 by 30 is, it's protecting 30% of Australia's lands and Australia's seas by 2030. And we've still got a way to go on land, obviously marine for other purposes as well. I won't go into the debate because obviously we're the Australian Land Conservation Alliance, so marine sort of slightly outside my field of expertise. But there's more, there's more to be delivered on that side as well. So, okay, what are the key parts of this funding? So there is a land acquisition fund. So this is a federal cornerstone funding that then is intended to be delivered in partnership with states and territories and with the philanthropic and the in the sector that the ALCA represents, the private land conservation sector. to acquire land for protection. So it could be for public protected areas, so conservation parks, national parks, and so on by state governments. It could be for private land conservation, so a land conservancy that ends up protecting the land under a covenant or through some other mechanism, and it could be it could of course be for Indigenous protected areas as well. Now, there's also explicitly this funding is going to include money for new Indigenous protected areas. There's ocean protection mentioned in there as well. We know that it's going to include OECMs, and for those who aren't familiar with the jargon, this is other area-based effective conservation measures. Essentially, this is where it's not a protected area, but it's governed and managed for biodiversity, even if it's, even if the area or the land is the primary purpose of managing that land's not biodiversity. It's still got a biodiversity management element to it. And we know that their focus will be on defence lands in the first instance. And they talk in passing about incentives for private land conservation, but we have no detail, of course, on what that means in practice. But then it has a bit of a grab bag of all sorts of other things as well, which aren't so focused on delivering 30 by 30, or at least not as far as we can easily tell. So they talk about havens for endangered species. Depends, I guess, on whether they end up being protected areas or not, as whether they're delivering on that 30 by 30 protection target. Nature repair funding, and at this stage we only have one method in the nature repair market that's been released and promulgated. That's the replanting native forest and woodland ecosystems method, which is meant to stack with carbon, and so that's not a protection method per se. Restoring degraded government land, again, no detail on what that looks like, and there's even mention of pest management. So not that any of these things are necessarily bad things to be investing in, but when the program is pitched as being delivering on 30 by 30, protection on land and seas, it's hard to see exactly how these things fit into that. So there are lots of questions. Now, I've spoken with a number of federal departmental officials already to ask the question around, well, what is the breakdown of the funding for all these different elements? And the answer at this stage is actually that's not fixed. It's not fully determined yet. Now, they obviously have something in their minds around what the breakup will be, but I guess it tells you that, and I didn't talk to this as to the genesis of this program, and really the genesis is around, we know that the EPBC reform process, was unsuccessful and was abandoned by the government during this term of Parliament, and they then have been looking for a narrative to shift to around, well, what are they delivering for nature, and what are they going to deliver, especially as they move into election and they can't have a narrative around environmental law reform. And so we know that they've chosen to invest this amount of funds into this program, the Australian Bushland Program. So we know the genesis of the funding, but it was also very late in the piece. And that's why, if you read through the budget papers, it actually technically says that the funding for this program is being held in what's called the contingency reserve. Now, that's not something to be concerned about, but it does say that this essentially has not been allocated at an earlier part of the process. It's quite late in the process that this money has been, this funding has been designed and allocated. So that's a large part as to why we don't have a lot of the detail yet. So there's lots of questions for us to ask of the federal government and department as we move forward. But it may well be that we don't have too much clarity for some weeks and maybe even months to come yet. All right, and what else can we say about where we're going to? So if you look at the portfolio budget statements, which is sort of the department responsible for delivering on the statements related to the department delivering on nature, ones that are particularly relevant to us is the planned protected area trajectory. You can see, on the slides there, they've confirmed that they've achieved 24%, which was the target for the financial year that we're just finishing up on. And they expect, to be on track, I guess, to get to 30% by 2030. So it's a wonderfully linear, set of targets they've put there. I can, in the Q&A, if people are interested, talk through exactly the breakdown of those numbers and how we've got to them. We do expect that the data that relates to the protected area data, which is called CAPAD for those who are familiar with it, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, I must confess, but the database of protected areas is meant to be coming out imminently, and so we'll be able to see the detail behind this 24%. Also, though, talks about threatened species performance, and it says it's on track to maintain or improve trajectory from previous year. But of course, if you think that through a little bit, the current trajectory is not very good. And so maintaining the current trajectory is not what I would call a win. So maybe there's a little bit of, if we're being unkind, we could say there's a bit of obfuscation there as to what's happening to threatened species performance. So I guess then, and I'm coming to conclusions rather rapidly, and part of that is, I guess you'll see that we don't have a substantial uplift in the nature, in the nature spend that wasn't already expected, other than of course this this new program, which is an additional $50 million a year. And so, if you're wondering why we're getting to conclusions already, it's because there's not actually too much to say this year on nature as there has been in previous years. So the biodiversity spend is approximately 480 million. So, less than 0.1% of the federal budget. We know that funding for 30 by 30 is underdone because, especially if we want to actually achieve what are called the CAR principles. So that's comprehensiveness, adequateness, representativeness. So it's not just a quantity target. There's also about the quality of the protected area estate that we that we deliver, and it's not clear yet how the quite minimal funding that's been allocated is going to get that built into the system as well. Also, and I haven't put it on the slide, but we don't have a lot of detail on how they're going to deliver the other targets as well that they're signed up to in the in the global biodiversity framework. In particular, the 30 by 30 restoration target, where we seek to restore 30% of all degraded areas by 2030. I mean, there was that, of course, brief mention around restoring degraded government lands, but beyond that, there's really no detail on where that funding or how we're going to achieve that in practice. The other thing that's quite peculiar, I guess, is there's not a new spend on the Saving Our Species program. And if you looked at the graphs earlier, the Saving Our Species program is going to be ending in this coming financial year, or at least the funding envelope. And, as that drops off, there's obviously, the opportunity is to go, well, we really need a renewal of threatened species funding. Some of it does get done through the Natural Heritage Trust and through, for example, the NRM bodies, but this dedicated funding that's available to any applicant, to apply, as it were, that money does end at the end of this next financial year. So anyway, as we come to the next budget, a really big opportunity, or really, a strong imperative, is for our sector, of course, to push on the need to renew that threatened species funding as a priority. There's also the usual problems with transparency of a Natural Heritage Trust. That's why it can be hard to know whether the figures that we're using in what I've shown are 100% correct, because it really is just so opaque as to what the breakdown is. And so, even sleuthing through the budget papers doesn't get us all the way. And so, this is something where I guess we have to rely on Parliament to get us the detail of the breakdown, or, of course, talking with the department after the fact. Other conclusions, well, look, a lot of these are ones you may have heard earlier in different forums. The environment budget's, only 2% larger now, but it was 10 years ago. And that's despite 10 years of economic growth at an average of, 2.4%. So, the environment budget is in real terms lagging dramatically behind the real GDP growth. We know that tax breaks and subsidies for fossil fuels are much, much bigger than the biodiversity spend. So using the Australian Institute's data, they estimate it's about, it's over 20 times the biodiversity spend. And also some great work by the Biodiversity Council tells us that subsidies for, for activities that harm nature, either moderately or, significantly harm nature, are about 50 times larger than the spend on biodiversity. So they estimated that it was, almost 27 billion a couple of years ago. You would obviously only imagine it's slightly higher than that by now. So they're rather, I guess, concerning background context to, the fact that we're not seeing a dramatic uplift in investment in nature. And so with that, and last, I guess, conclusion, I mean, if you were to compare the media statements that ALCA did for last year's budget and then this year's budget, there's not really a huge amount of difference in them, I guess. Australia can't afford this bad budget for nature, and then federal budget leaves nature underfunded again. So, it's not nice to be, I guess, a herald of bad news. And, we should be clear that it's not all bad news. That Australian Bushland Program is, of course, still a significant additional measure, although it's spread out over quite a period of time. But nonetheless, as Jodie said in her introduction, we're still facing a chronically under-resourced, underfunded environment budget. And so now I guess we enter into questions and answers. I'd be interested. I'll just stop sharing so we can see Jodie and myself again. So
Thanks,
I haven't been keeping a track of the questions, but I hope we've got some, Jodie.
Thank you, Michael. We do. And a reminder, if you do have any burning questions for Michael, please put them in the chat as I go through them. I'll try and consolidate similar questions. One was just a query on the land care, the NHT, and whether it includes land care. You gave a sort of brief high-level description of the kinds of things it funds. It does include NRM and land care activities, but have you got any further qualifications around that question, Michael?
So my understanding is it does include land care activities,
Yes.
but I know that the National Land Care Program ended in 2023, yes, or at least the current phase did. So again, it's quite opaque as to what the breakdown is. And in fact, that's exactly one of the things that we're going to need to interrogate. I mean, the Natural Heritage Trust is really quite a black box. And so it's very hard to make definitive answers because it's not just it's not included in the budget papers in essence. So we have to dig for the details elsewhere. So no, sorry, I don't have a huge amount of clarity on the breakdown, unfortunately.
But the short answer is yes, it does. And
Yes.
so the next question, or a couple of questions, comment and question goes to the EPBC. I think firstly, really, we've got a comment, Michael, an agreement that it is hard to find from Adam Muir from WWF, and that the Environment Minister's Office as well has confirmed in writing that $76 million for EPA has been confirmed across 25-26 and 26-27, and that has been retained. It is in the budget, but confirms it's hard to find. I think that answers a question there about whether there's any sign of funding for the establishment of the independent EPA, which Labor promised if re-elected, or is that in the uncertain EBBC reform costs?
So, I mean, I note in that something that came out of the Labor caucus just earlier this week, as we had the very rapid passage of legislation around the Morgan's Gate and the change to the EPBC Act there, that it was reported that there was essentially a deal done where the Labor platform around establishing an EPA and an Environment Information Australia would continue into the next term of Parliament should they be re-elected. That there was essentially a negotiation or a deal done within the caucus on that. So that then would make it very surprising to me if the money had not been retained. And also just the signalling and course that it sends. So even though I sleuthed for it and didn't find it, and I'd be keen to speak to Adam later to see where he found it. That's I guess that was expected that the money would be retained. So.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. And so another series of questions starts to dive a little more into the detail of the Bushland Fund. I guess the first pertinent question is, you mentioned in your presentation, Michael, that the details of how that fund will be delivered are not yet clear, and you talked about the timing of its development. Really important question, does it mean there might be an opportunity to influence the details of how the money might be spent?
I mean, look, I think the short answer to that is yes. I'm not sure that there's necessarily a huge amount of influence that can occur on the internal, breakdowns of the numbers. I imagine the department has already, come to some conclusions as to how they might choose to break it down. That doesn't mean that if after the election, government that's returned wishes to continue with a program, that a minister won't have their own view as to what those allocations are. So they could still shift. But I think the department itself has a handle on, if not the exact numbers, at least very, the ballpark on what the breakdown will be. But I certainly think that in terms of the program design, because this money has been allocated so late in the piece and designed so late in the piece, even though organisations like ALCA and its members and others have been talking to them for quite some time around the design of a program that would deliver on 30 by 30 and other GBF targets, that there's still going to be some room to discuss the detail of what it looks like actually in practice now that they go to implement. So short answer is yes, I think there is an opportunity to, whether it's influence or just really, engage, to engage and ensure that what we get is fit for purpose.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. There's a few questions here around a bit more around the design of the fund. I think there's a question there around, do we know any more about the design? I think you've given us a bit of clarification that at this point we don't understand yet how it's going to be delivered and implemented. And there's a question around, whether you can clarify whether or not we got confirmation that the government was establishing a fund to kickstart demand in the nature repair market, either through the bushland program or outside of that.
Okay, so we know that the overarching fund, of course, is going to deliver on lots and lots of things. Sorry, just coughing. And the acquisition program part of it may only be, and we don't know yet, but it may only be, say, half or even a third of that $50 million a year funding. So, but we know the very basic design is essentially as ALCA and our partners in the 30 by 30 collaboration. So Pew and WWF and TNC have been advocating, which is cornerstone federal government funding with state and territory government contributions, and then external domestic land and the Land Conservancy and philanthropic contribution. So we know that very basic model is at least where they're starting from on that. But in terms then shifting across the nature repair question, it's hard to know without knowing the quantum whether this is going to be sufficient to kickstart the market in earnest. I would have thought no. If there's going to be an acquisition fund and there's going to be new IPAs funded through this and there's a few other things funded through this, it's hard to see that that's a lot. There's going to be a lot of money driven through government procurement. There's also a question, of course, about whether, could it be that this funding is for the development of methods and other, supports for the Nature Repair Fund, more broadly rather than government procurement. And we don't know that detail yet. I mean, I'd hope it was government procurement, and I would think it is, but we actually just don't know.
Thanks, Michael. There's some more questions there that go to things like the CAR principle, and whether, how much we know about both what's been achieved so far and how this can target it. Also around the framing of 30 by 30 as a target. And I think probably one of the most important points to make here is that the 30 by 30 target is not just about driving scale, that in fact the target itself talks about effective management. It talks about adequate representation of all the diversity of our ecosystems and protecting the high priority biodiversity areas. So there's some questions there that I think go to that. I think what's important to remember is that some of these elements of the Bushland Fund that might appear to be restoration absolutely could be ensuring that some of those other elements, the quality elements of the target, get implemented as well, including effective management through, for example, pest animal management in certain places. So it's probably more a response and comment on that. But Michael, the question to you extends out from the 30 by 30 protection target to the restoration target. So, we know Australia has signed up to a global agreement to have priority degraded areas under effective restoration by 2030. And the revised Australia Strategy for Nature acknowledges that a national implementation strategy is needed. Is it true that there is nothing in the budget, including the ABP, that could fund such planning or to remove some of the key barriers to restoration, including restoration through the nature repair market?
So, I mean, there is funding it's clear that the Bushland program is intended to fund the nature repair market in some way, shape or form. Again, we'd hope it was through government procurement. We don't know that for sure, but that's what we would presume. And at this stage, that's a method that seeks to stack with carbon methods. And so there is a restoration element to that money that as the nature repair market currently stands. Now, as more methods are developed. There's a different question as to, as to how much of the money might go into different areas or not. So it's not true to say there's absolutely no potential money, but we just can't say for sure, is the problem. I also note that, we know that there's contention over, well, what counts as degraded areas, and that will be rather critical. Will the government try to seek to, I guess, define its way out of the problem, as it were, by saying, well, actually, we're going to count certain areas as degraded areas and only focus on priority degraded areas, as it were. So, no, look, I wouldn't probably go so far as to say there's nothing in it for restoration, but it's not clear to what extent what's in it for restoration.
Great, thank you. Just a bit of an update on the NHT thing, information's coming in from the chat, a response from Peter Dixon. Currently, NHT has some minor funding for Landcare Australia and the National Landcare Network, but the previous requirement for the NHT funding to national NRM bodies to hypothecate direct funding to Landcare groups has been removed. So that's just a comment from the audience. Thank you, Peter. The next series of, I'll go to one more question, more specific question. So out of interest, noting the massive spend on subsidies for fossil fuels, what's the comparison, if you've got any, with spend on renewable infrastructure and subsidies? Have you got any sense of that, noting that this budget analysis is focused on the biodiversity space?
Yeah, look, I'm really sorry I don't, although we can definitely, we can be certain that it's a magnitude of, sort of magnitude much greater, of course, in terms of what's been spent on the renewables rollout. And, whilst I'm not tallying up all the figures that Minister Bowen's announcing, I am, do receive his media releases. And I know that it's, many multiples of the money that we're receiving in, in the environment sector. So, sorry, I don't have a simple, clear answer for you on that. But yes, it's it's sort of magnitude large, absolutely.
Great. Bloomberg released an article noting 250 million is in the budget to boost the nature repair market. I think we've clarified the answer to this question. Is this your understanding, Michael? And if so, what reference are they reading into here?
So, no, the 250 million is not all for the nature repair market. However, nature repair market is included in the list of things that this 250 million is being contemplated to help support. So, but again, we don't know whether that's directly through government procurement or whether that's broader support for, essentially the market platform and infrastructure. So, no, it's not quite right.
Thank you. There's a specific question here about a particular set of funds that might or might not be available for partnerships with First Nations. Have you got any visibility through the budget as to whether any of the budget allocations are specifically targeted to First Nations partnerships, either for land care or protected areas management?
Yeah, so I mean, there is money obviously for new IPAs, and there's ongoing budget allocations for Indigenous protected areas. In terms of the partnerships, the land acquisition fund, of course, could be through Indigenous partners. As long as it was a protected area, ultimately, whether through private land conservation or for an Indigenous protected area. I note that there's ongoing funding for the Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation, although I must confess I'm not clear as to what extent they engage, how much of that is then in those sorts of partnerships. So, look, the short answer is that there is some scope within the Australian Bushland Program funding, but beyond that, I haven't delved into the detail, I'm sorry.
Thank you. In summary, what will this mean for conservation organisations? Will they receive trickle-down funding to expand their programs and operations? What's your reflection on that, Michael?
Well, look, I mean, there is a minor uplift, as we can see through, not just the Australian Bushland Program, but also for reef-related activities, and very small amount for ocean related activities. So, it's not quite business as usual. There is an uplift, but it's not a substantial uplift. So, I mean, it depends on what your organisation does and where they operate and what they do. I mean, I guess if you're a land conservancy, then there might be some more opportunities around land acquisition that weren't there previously. And if you're, working on threatened species recovery work, we know the budget allocation in the coming year is not as big as it has been in previous years, and then the money runs out. So, I think it depends on the type of organisation you have. But there's certainly not rivers of money, as it were. So I think for a lot of organisations, it's going to be business as usual, or at least close to. So.
Thanks, Michael. The remaining questions, and there's a few of them, go to really, the reflecting on the pressure that the government feels to be investing in nature, goes to a bit of navel gazing. What can we do to further advance, increase budgets and opportunities for the sector? So I guess this is just really a general question and a reflection, Michael. Are we loud enough? Are we being effective as a sector? What can we do, either individually as organisations or as a sector, to make a stronger case for the investment in Australia's nature?
Yeah, look, I mean, to answer the question, are we allowed enough? And maybe this is controversial, but the answer is no. I mean, clearly we're not, because we know that people care about the environment. The Biodiversity Council and others do some really great polling on, people's care about different environmental issues and how much it's important to them, especially in the context of an upcoming election. We know it is a top order issue for quite a large proportion of people. Having said that, of course, there's a question around how hard or soft that support is. There are plenty of people who really care about the environment, but they have to care about, where their next paycheck is coming from, or their next, how they're going to pay for their rent is coming from. And that can obviously take, and will take priority, for people in those sort of circumstances. So, look, what can we do? I mean, it's the inevitable, it's the constant challenge, I guess, for our sector, look, I think there's twofold. There's the raising the awareness for those people who care about nature that we are actually in a pathway of accelerating decline, and that we do have a major, major challenge ahead of us. And so to engage those people who care about nature but don't realise the trouble it's in, and join them to the cause of speaking up for nature. It's also, I think, messaging for some of the more, I guess, hard-headed, people who care about the monetary side of things, to explain, that nature does underpin our economic prosperity and our social, and human well-being, and that, even if you don't, even if nature is not something that gets you out of bed in the morning, that it still has real-world ramifications on you and your family if we don't actually do something about this. That we can't just keep drawing down on our natural assets forever with the idea that it's always going to be there and we can just keep free riding forever. So, I mean, look, there are no silver bullet answers to this. We know that. We do, I guess, have to keep working as a sector together. And look, I guess plugging a bit of a plug for ALCA in all this. I mean, one of the great things about ALCA and some other organisations, that have been formed in recent years, is we're trying to aggregate some of those voices out there to, I guess, demonstrate greater weight when we do talk with parliamentarians and politicians and try to talk out to the public. That sense of that this is an entire sector that's behind a particular message and concern. We really are stronger together. And ALCA and others, ways of being able to aggregate those concerns and, I guess, magnify them. But otherwise, all I can say is, all of you out there, keep up the good fight.
Absolutely. And I think, as another person has commented, also ensuring that what we're doing, given the limited resources, we're doing effectively, we're innovating, we're using best practice to make those dollars go as far as they can. I was going to draw the questions to a close, but one last question snuck in towards the end, which is one that, Michael, I know you will love. So I'm going to ask it, which is if you could comment on the potential opportunities for having Queensland join the rest of the states in offering land tax incentives for conservation covenant. Now, while not directly relevant to our federal budget today, I thought I'd let you answer that one last question.
Oh, well, thank you very much for the Dorothy Dix, whoever put it in the chat. No, look, Queensland is the last state that still levies land tax on people who have, they're called nature refuges in Queensland, but, conservation covenants is what they're known across most of the country. So, yes, it's certainly something we're working on with the Queensland government. And there was a recent sort of round of budget, pre-budget submissions there, but certainly I'd encourage you to contact your local MP and your, also the minister about the importance of trying to provide some public support, as all the other state jurisdictions do, for, people who are, are trying to, steward nature for future generations of Australians and then doing it under their own steam and then, being penalised for it, I guess, compared to other jurisdictions is, can leave a bit of a sour taste in people's mouths when they put their heart and soul into these things. So yes, absolutely, be loud and, send off some correspondence to the minister and your local MP. Absolutely.
Thank you, Michael. Michael, thank you so much for that detailed analysis, for taking the time to trawl through the pages and pages of budget information so that you can let us know what the current state of our federal budget is as we head into the next year ahead, and including that as we head towards an election. There was some discussion there on, what the sector can do and who and how we can speak up. The latest research from the Biodiversity Council shows 77% of Australians say nature will influence their vote. ALCA is calling on political leaders to step up and respond to that, as are other groups around the country. And we know that this budget, as we've just heard from Michael, does little to respond to the expectations of the majority of Australians that were part of that survey. So what can you do? I think, Michael, you answered that well. Remember to put in submissions. Tell the ABC, your vote, that you care about nature as we head to an election, so that they're asking people the kinds of questions we need. They've got a your vote program, thing. Put in your details. Tell them what you think. Consider and review the policies of all parties as we head towards election mode, and make sure that they are genuinely considering the climate and nature challenges as they put policies forward that will affect our future. To create the Australia that we need and want, we know that we must invest in nature and in the people who steward it. Right across the country, thousands of landholders, including First Nations peoples, farmers, graziers, landholders, conservation organisations, are managing, protecting and restoring biodiversity. Building resilient communities, we must urgently scale up this work and the investment that will enable it. So as the pattern of chronic underfunding and ultimately undervaluing of nature continues, the private land conservation sector, those of you that have joined the call and those that you have supported the work, continues to get on with your job. The environment isn't just our sector's priority, it's an issue that matters to voters, to landholders, to rural and regional communities, and to the business leaders across Australia. And we need our government to recognise that investing in nature is investing in Australia's future. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Michael, again, thank you for the time you've taken to both investigate and share this information. And we look forward to seeing you all very soon.